Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Dan Schmerlo. I'm at Economic Research Service in the Department of Agriculture. I believe there are 3 papers today, so we don't have to adhere by the strict 15-minute limit. So I believe Chelsea is first. All right.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chelsea Arnold. I'm currently at West Texas A&M University. This is something that originated in Kansas, hence the name, where I was finishing up graduate school, but at Kansas State University, with Dr. Taylor as the main advisor. But we're going to talk about impacts of tenant experience and social capital on leasing decisions by landowners in Kansas, or more shortly and briefly, who and what you know and does it matter as a young producer, specifically in Kansas. So just to give a little bit of background, in the US, there's around 2 million non-operator landlords across the entire United States. Of those, about 70% are principal landowners, meaning that they themselves own the land. They may not necessarily be operators of the land, but are principal landowners, meaning that they own not a corporation or an LLC. Of those non-operator landowners. And we can see that in Kansas, around half of all Kansas farmland is leased, which is slightly higher than the national average at around 40%, which we know the national average is a little skewed just because you have large crop states with less populations like in the Midwest and a little bit more skewed on the eastern side and in the southern regions. But Kansas lands at about 9th in farmland rent received and accounts for about a $1.4 billion industry. So for a mid-sized state like Kansas in agriculture, this is a large revenue stream. In the US and in Kansas, there are 3 main contract choices. Crop share, most people will be familiar with crop share, is you split the risk to a certain extent between the landowner and the tenant, and that you when the harvest is brought in and grain is sold, a certain percentage is split between the landowner and the tenant. And then also sometimes inputs and irrigation pivots and things like that are negotiated within that. It is one of the most used in Kansas at around 60% crop share leasing. The next most common is fixed cash rent. That's our more traditional. You have an agreed upon set of money paid either once, twice, or multiple times a year, as we found. But it's a little less risk on the landowner and a little more straightforward in that on December 1st, I must be paid X amount of money. Same thing with March 1st or whatever the agreed upon in. And then flex is kind of a hybrid mixture of those, but it's only at around about 5% usage in Kansas and about 4% usage in the US. So while there's studies on that, we mainly focus on the top 2 today. So farmland leasing across the US, land prices for purchasing land have increased across the US, almost doubling in the US standard over the last 20 years. Again, we are talking the skew of the US. So it gets a little, but that stays true in Kansas as well, that overall land prices are increasing as land is being competitive. The average US producer has also been aging since the early 90s. That is a statement that has been said since one of the USDA reports in the early 90s of our aging landowners, and we just keep bumping the number because they tend to not retire. Farmland leasing is a pro for most tenants simply because there's little capital required up front, but especially with young producers because little capital is required up front. And overall, it offers less financial risk because at the end of the day, if you have a bad crop year, you've only had X amount that you have to pay instead of having to pay those land mortgage payments, things like that, that you are stuck to. So young producers specifically have less access available to land and capital and are offered often at a disadvantage. This is something Kachova and Ahern have studied multiple times. They have a 2012, a 2018, 2019 article that kind of come out to this fact. We know that leasing also allows young producers to acquire economies of scale faster and earlier. And if you do acquire those earlier, you're more likely to be deemed successful in USDA terms, meaning at least profitable at larger scales as you gain more time and experience. So we wanted to look at the relationship of young producers to landowners. So we came up with a conceptual model that I won't stick on too long here, but basically landowners look at certain things when deciding to lease to, right? You can face several different choices in tenants. It can be somebody that you have leased to their family for multiple generations. It can be someone you don't know, but they have these individual preferences that can impact who they decide to rent to and under what conditions. And with every possible tenant to choose to, a landowner has this level of uncertainty with it. So if you talk to a landowner that has only ever rented to the same family, and now that family is not farming, they're going to have a certain risk factor of leasing to someone they haven't known and been as comfortable with. There's this idea of social capital, or this unmeasurable or harder to measure relationship status, and can we put a number with that? But basically it comes down to the probability of defaulting on their payments at the end of the year, because also typically landowners leasing with people, the higher the risk, they tend to want a fixed cash rent and not a crop share, again, because of the risk sharing aspect. So in theory, younger producers have a higher probability of defaulting on their lease and on their payments simply because maybe they don't have as much experience, or they have less capital available. Or we also know that young producers are often have outside jobs. That is their first income. So again, from this, we have a couple of derivatives that come out of this, but again, mainly it comes down to experience. The less experience you have, the more a landowner is going to want fixed cash and will have a higher rent value for it. And with more experience, it goes the opposite way. Same thing with these. And social capital, we did not put a sign on simply because it depends on the person. Some people have been jaded by family and do not want to rent with family and see that as a negative aspect. Others only rent family friend. So we did not in the conceptual model assign to it. Our survey was sent out at the in January of 21, and it did a lot of different things, but more specifically, we had demographics, personal property. What we're going to focus on today is landowner preferences and discrete choice scenarios, but we wanted to get that demographic and information on the land that they rent to kind of help learn a little bit more. So here's an example of the scenarios sent out. So we pulled 3,600 landowners, randomly chosen through the 9 different NAS regions to make sure that we were getting at least some from every region. And we had about 700 and 800 responses and about 670 that actually filled everything out correctly and had good discrete choice scenarios. But you can see we had relationship with the tenant and rent. And so every producer or every landowner was given that this tenant you're choosing is a 30-year-old, and they only vary by these. So they either have no experience to 10 years plus, or their relationship status, and then rent was based on that NAS region's average, county average, and either a standard deviation above or a standard deviation below. So our survey response rate, these are regional. So within the blocks, you can see where they came from. We had fairly, okay, I mean, it's a survey. You always want better results, but across the state, it was at least consistent, with the most being in central and southwestern. And our data summary kind of went to show the kind of averages that we've been seeing. They are mostly male. They are mostly males that are over the age of 65. Here we have a 68-ish average. Years of farming experience is a little high, but look at that standard deviation. So that comes down to, this is a survey regret thing of, in defining everything else, we did not define experience. So some people who grew up on a farm at 20 years old may say they have 18, 20 years of experience, where other people see experience past the age of when they started working hands-on. So we could see on the responses that I would have an 80-year-old individual who would put 80 years of experience. So it's a little skewed there. But we see our relationship types and our relationship lengths match up previous studies that have been done through KFMA surveys at longer relationships, fewer number of tenants, and mostly in this family friend categories. One of the things I want to point to are some of these landowner preference questions that we ask. So when renting to a beginning farmer, there is more risk involved in this transaction. Disagree to strongly disagree. So you see that we have an overwhelming majority either agree or strongly agree with that statement. But then immediately after, we asked, when renting to a beginning farmer, I require a higher lease rate per acre. And this is the slide I want you to remember when we get to the end, because this is what we found in talking to landowners is they say, yes, there's more risk. Yes, but we have to help these young producers. We want them to be successful, and we won't require more. We won't. Hold that thought till the end. So our research question came down to, Kansas landowners require more dollars per acre when leasing to a young producer. And also we took the first baby steps into the relationships with those. Again, I'm not going to stay too long on empirical framework. Most of us have seen random utility models. We did a multinomial logit model where the willingness to pay was found through the ratio of the character preferences. And so I won't stick on this very far, but of the relationships, one was dropped. So we have family, friend, stranger, and acquaintance. All of those were defined in the survey as what family friend meant, what did acquaintance meant. And then same thing with our experience. But we have our final model here at the bottom, but I would rather get into things like this. Overall, statistically significant signs were expected, but what we want to focus on is on our willingness to lease. So what we found was across the entire data set, if you have no experience as a young producer in Kansas, you are out of luck in a lot of ways, because the data shows that there's a $45 to $60 range of a premium that if you asked a landowner across the board, if you have absolutely no experience before I'll rent to you, I need at least this much more given to me. We'll talk about that in a minute. As we see, as we go up 5 years, 10 years experience, it gets a little higher. It's a little strange to see that 5 years is actually lower. We recognize that. That's one of the things we're trying to suss out. Why is that? And you'll see we did regional in a moment. Family friend, you get slightly discounted, and acquaintance, you get discounted a little more. But because this was a survey sent out, and because numbers can run small and willingness to lease tend to do better the more data you have, especially multinomial willingness to lease, we wanted to do regional, meaning that we took all the observations for Western Kansas. So the 3 NAS regions that fall into Western Kansas. Overall, landowners have lower premiums for no experience, but don't offer as large of a discount to closer relationships. So they value experience over relationships. And you can see as we move from the western part of Kansas to the eastern part of Kansas, we tend to go a little bit more towards family as we go. Central Kansas, we have a bit higher premium for no experience than the landowners in western Kansas. We offer a bit higher discount towards closer relationships. And then finally, eastern Kansas, landowners have the highest premium for no experience and offer the highest discount for young producers that are family or friends. Again, if you think of Kansas, if any of you are familiar with Kansas, western Kansas is larger operations, less populated, mostly dry land, some irrigated, As you move across the state, especially into northern Kansas and northeastern Kansas, the soil type changes. You have the Flint Hills, it goes to more pasture versus rent. We did ask a question of, is the land you lease pasture or cropland? And for the pasture only, just didn't have enough in the sample set to actually run the numbers. But we can see this kind of familiarity as we move across the state as what we pay attention to more and what we favor more. So within that, we also wanted to look at how much of the average rent are you expecting me to pay over? So we did a percentage of premium discount so this is all Western, all Central. These are not the NAS regions. But if you can see in the black, for Central, for no experience, we have an 82.9% premium. But when you account for, remember our range earlier was about $47 to $69, but when you account for the average rent in that area, northeastern Kansas is actually the one that requires the most in terms of a premium. 5 years experience, we kind of see that go down as we go across. Same thing with 10 years experience, where you actually get discounted in the lower corner. And then for family, friend, and acquaintance, we kind of see that there's a bit better of a discount as we move across the state as well. And then lastly, this is where we went in and looked at that regional, but we wanted to look at specifically, do you currently lease versus do you not? It kind of told the same story, but we lost some statistical significance within that, which is where you can see if it's dotted out, that means it was not statistically significant at all of the rest were statistically significant at the 10% level. So conclusion, what does this actually matter and why? Kansas landowners view producers as riskier to lease to. We know that from our focus groups that we did. We know that from our survey and our answers in their preferences, but they say they will not require more per acre. In theory, when they're in front of their friends and family, and even on the survey, they state that they will not. Kansas landowners do, however, require more dollars per acre, sometimes over 100% more per acre than those with no experience in our early modeling. But lastly, Kansas landowners may need to be subsidized to encourage leasing to young producers with little or no experience. And this is where I want to pause and talk about Nebraska for a moment. Nebraska actually has a program. It started off as an extension program where it matched aging landowners with young producers. It was a volunteer basis program where they filled out surveys and they kind of matched based on personalities and said, you two should work together. Here's a 3-year contract lease. And that has now turned into an actual tax incentive program. So landowners in Kansas, it's called the Land Link program, or in Nebraska, can actually apply to be in this. A landowner gets a tax write-off, essentially, and young producers get to work with those landowners, get offered a average price or sometimes even a lower average per acre price. And they work together for 3 years. The only thing that's asked of the young producer is that they do take a financial risk and analysis class at any of the universities, but they get reimbursed for that. But it's in its early parts in Nebraska. It's only been around for a few years, but they've seen success with that. Kansas is actually starting to, not at that level where it's at the government level of tax write-offs, but matching programs are starting to become a thought in the idea of extension economists in Kansas, especially as they see the need of aging landowners and the transition of land becoming an issue. But that is all I have. Do we have any questions? Yes.
So in your survey, do you know whether those leases that landlords willing to offer is multi-year leases or 1 year, or do they're willing to offer different length of contracts to younger producers? Or
yes. So in our survey to keep it control, we did 1 year. We thought it might help with the risk assessment of it, of how much would you be willing to for just 1 year. But in our survey of their leasing attitudes right now, most of them did multi-year contracts, especially the longer the leasing relationship, the longer that they would meet. We asked the question of how often will you meet up with your landowner? And you see a wide variety of, I talk to them every 2 years to, I see them in the co-op every other Saturday morning. So you've got some large variability in that, but for our leasing scenario, it was 150 acres of irrigated cropland where the producer is 30 years old and then only changes, and we described it as good quality cropland, and the only differences were the prices offered in that and then the relationships, things like that. Yes.
Would you consider written versus unwritten leases and potential legal enforceability?
Yes.
After the previous?
So Kansas hates a written lease. They're very passionate about their not wanting to do written leases. So in those that actually answered that answer, and we put a binary on it, I lost a lot of data set in that of the ones that did written versus non-written, which is where we got more out of the currently leased versus do not currently lease. But for some reason, I'm not originally from Kansas, so that kind of threw me off, but they see it as a trust issue. So that comes into that social capital of something we can't really measure. They see it as a sign of mistrust. If you ask me to put something on paper and sign it versus a handshake deal. You see younger generations don't follow that as quite as much because younger generations tend to go more with, we want the security of the paper, but a survey done by KFMA 2014, 2015 showed over half of the state does not use written leases. And on the surveys that were sent back to me, there were some that X'd the question out, said I will never. So, yes.
Technically, I'm supposed to have discussion slides, but I'll just ask my question. This is very interesting. So that discrepancy between the choice experiment and what they answered on the survey. So they're not willing to make adjustments on the rental price.
Yes.
If they're not experienced. You think just from talking to operators, if they're making the adjustments on other margins, such as you mentioned written or something, probably not, but either cash for share or perhaps they're putting in clauses related to decision making within the contract for beginning farmers.
I think it comes down to a very individual basis. So when you get a bunch of farmers in a room together talking about the future of agriculture, they go to, yes, let's help, because that's exactly what we did. Yes, let's help young producers. Let's do this. And they're all gung ho. But when you put them to money, they then start talking, well, I need to know the financial history of this young producer before I ever talk. If I don't know him and I don't know his parents or their parents, I need to sit down with them and I need to see their bank records. Do I know if do they buy new equipment or do they buy old equipment? And they want to determine this financial savvy of this person. But I think individually across the state, you definitely have some producers that if they know of them in some way, they make small adjustments. But probably the biggest we see is they'll go fixed cash before they ever go crop share with a new person that they don't know. And then once they start gaining some of that trust, it gets a little better and you can get better contracts out of it. But I think it's very regional and individual because Western Kansas are a bit more dry on the nose. We do things because we've always done them this way. They do want to help, and as you move to Eastern Kansas, you just have a different region and you still have some of that. But it's, again, when you're talking pasture rent versus crop renting, it's a bit different of a dynamic too, especially for range cattle and things like that. So any other? Yes.
I would say that the preference for no written contract extends pretty broad, probably
Yeah.
true in Ontario, Canada as well. But my question to you is, what does the subset of farmers, young farmers with no experience look like? And the reason why I'm asking that is that I would suspect that there's very few people ever going to somebody to rent land that has no experience, that farm experience, that have a pretty substantial background
Yes.
typically.
So that's one of the things that was discussed at this, and we expected to see a crazy number for no experience, right? Because it's less unheard of. I don't know the specific numbers on it, but I would say it's on the lower end. Most will have at least that 5 years experience. And then it comes down to defining experience too, right? The landowner that filled out the survey that was an 80-year-old that put 80 years of experience, how did he perceive the word experience in the survey? And when I say 5 years experience, as a 30-year-old, even 10 years experience as a 30-year-old to that 80-year-old farmer that put 80 years of experience, to him, he may read that, well, this person never grew up on a farm, never. And so we kind of wish we would have done this sort of, did you grow up? And so the original thought was to do a dual survey, and we attempted and sent out surveys via online to the young producers at Kansas Farm Bureau. And just after weeks of pushing, had less than 200, because we really wanted to kind of get the dynamics of landowners and young producers, because young producers have a say in it too. And so their discrete choice scenario looked more like, well, what if this landowner wants to meet with you monthly? And what if they require seeing your financials? And what if they do this? And it just, COVID can be the easy excuse, but really it's that it was poor timing on everybody's part. And it's an online survey. So yes.
Did you ask if they were an absentee landowner versus
Yes.
an owner operator?
Yes. So the majority, I won't say the majority, a solid 50%-ish, maybe, I think it was around 48, 50% were in the state within 10 miles, and then it goes to 100 miles. So when you're in Kansas, 100 miles could be Colorado, Nebraska, and like that. But, 100 miles, you can be on your parcel that day. But there were about 20% that were true absentee. I sent surveys. My friend and I put labels on the surveys that were randomly, and you had some Arizona, Washington, DC, like little bits of everywhere. And that comes with it too. So kind of skews the data. So that's where we try to control where we could. But it showed no significant difference. So that's why we didn't have anything up there right now. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right, technically, I was supposed to give a discussive presentation, but I just want to say it was a very good, good read, and I wish I read that before we started our presentation. It set up the institution of ag land renting very well. Okay. Is there a way to go full screen with this?
I don't think when you open it with the browser.
Oh, let's try do they not have Adobe?
You can do it in Edge. You don't need Edge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, here we are. Okay. Thank you. My name is Dan Schmerlo. This is a joint work with Wes Burnett and Scott Callahan. All three of us are at the Economic Research Service, USDA. This is Farmland Tenancy and Conservation Practice Adoption. Okay, so since we work for the government, I just like to say that the findings and conclusions of this presentation are those of the authors and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. And this research was supported by the Intramural Research Program of the USDA's Economic Research Service. Okay, so in this project, we are doing something kind of similar to the previous paper. We're looking at the adoption of conservation practices and across fields of different tenancy type. And when I mean by that, I mean fields that are cash rented versus fields that are share rented or fields that are owner operated. Okay, and so we're going to use data from the ARM survey from 2010 to 2013, as well as 2015 to 2019, to look at the adoption of three practice groups. The first is reduced tillage, the cover cropping, and then structural practices. And we chose these three because they represent kind of different timelines as far as the realization of on-farm benefits, right? Going from short-term to long-term. What we also do in this paper, we examine the norms, like the last paper, we're examining the norms of ag land renting and thinking about how they may impact conservation practices adoption. So in a way, this is a continuation of the Bigelow, Borchers, and Hubbs 2016 report that uses the total survey from 2014. We'll also be looking at the total survey from 2014 to look at some contract characteristics. And just to give you a preview of the results, what we find is that after controlling for farmer, and plot characteristics, we find that rented plots, surprisingly, they actually exhibit lower STIR ratings than owner-operated plots, meaning they are adopting conservation tillage systems at a higher rate. They're disturbing the soil less, hence a lower STIR index value. We find that owned and rented plots are indistinguishable in the adoption of cover crops. And then we find that cash and share rented plots are less likely to possess structural practices. Although the interpretation on these results are a bit different. The first two are contemporaneous practices from the year that was surveyed. For structural practices, those could have been implemented in the year of the survey or previous. So the interpretation is a bit different. Okay, so just kind of go through, these are from the total survey from 2014. We're not able to link this information into the regressions using the ARMS data in a bit, but this is just for illustrative purposes to think about some of the incentives to adopt practices. Okay, so there's this idea that people on rented plots are less likely to adopt conservation practices or otherwise engage in good soil stewardship because they may hold uncertainty over how long they're going to be on a plot before the lease is modified or terminated or simply not renewed. So they're less likely to engage in something that only has long-term benefits for them, on-farm benefits. In addition, there's this idea that any improvements that they do make may be capitalized into their rental rate in the future. So they simply won't make any improvements to the soil. So, however, there is some kind of institutions and norms in ag renting or ag rental markets that may challenge this kind of this conventional thinking. The first is that well, this is actually not quite, but the first kind of characteristic is 45% of all rental acreage is under unwritten contracts. Now, the total survey is both cropland and ranch land. Our results later are going to be focusing on cropland. But yeah, 45% of all rental acreage is under unwritten contracts. As last presentation kind of demonstrated, that this demonstrates a fair bit of trust between the tenant and the landlord. Alan Luke 92, this is kind of an old anecdote, but as Chelsea suggested, yeah, if contracts are written, they're often very short, they're very simple, and the only attributes that contract over is simply the surface area of the land and how much for how long. Going off at this point, we see that this is also from the total survey. We see that they asked when landlords get involved in decision making, this has to do with one season or temporary conservation practices and permanent conservation practices. We see that when surveyed, these landlords usually don't get involved. They don't feel the need to get involved or perhaps put some content within the lease about decision making. If they are worried about the exploitation of their land, for example, either they're not interested or they think the monitoring is too costly. As we see for cash renters, the decision making for one season conservation practices is the majority of it's tenant only, right? And same with hybrid, share, and free renters. The proportion in which the landlord gets involved is a little higher for share renters, which makes sense given that they're often sharing or splitting input costs, so they might have a bigger role in decision making there. And then even for permanent conservation practices, we can think of these as like structural practices, like buffer strips. It's usually the tenant that is making the decision making for the majority of the time, with the exception of share renting. There we see that for share renting, the landlord is involved the majority of the time in some capacity. Similar to what the previous presentation was going over, 33% of rented farmland acreage is leased to someone related to the landlord or operator. Okay, and these proportions are pretty similar across cash, hybrid, and share and free acreage. In fact, I think free acreage, about half of free acreage has a family relation, which makes sense. And again, why is this important? Well, if you're related to someone who owns land, either you may be the preferred buyer or you may inherit the land one day. So you may act, as if you own it, because any consequences of your actions, either positive or negative, you may still be on that plot when they're realized, right? And finally, long-term rental relationships. About 38.5% of rented farmland acreage is leased to someone who's occupied the plot for over 10 years. These groups are pretty consistent across the four contract categories. And again, the longer you've been on the land, the more likely, I guess, the expectation is you'll be on it for a long time. And any consequences of your production or management decisions, you may be around to realize. So these these four variables, they're in the total survey. Unfortunately, 3 of them, all but this last one here, are not observed in ARMs. So we're not able to capture the effect of those in ARMs, but except this tenure length. So they may inform the coefficient estimates we see later on. So anyways, we look at 3 practice groups here: reduced tillage, use the STIR index to measure disturbance of the soil, cover crops, and structural practices. As we see here, if we look at, we use the ARMS years from 2010 through 2019 for a variety of crops. We see some crops we actually observe twice, and we have full coverage except cover crops. There's no cover crop question asked for a few years in the early 2010s there. Okay, so let's start with the soil, the STIR rating or STIR index, soil disturbance. Remember here, lower values mean you're disturbing the soil less, so you're more likely engaging in conservation tillage systems. We have the quartiles here. We have owner-operated, cash lease, and share, and we see that the cash and share plots are clocking in at lower values than the owner-operated plots. So some suggested evidence that people who are on rented plots for whatever reason are might be engaging in conservation tillage systems at a higher rate. To verify this, what we're going to do is we're going to take those years of ARMS, we're going to pool them together. We're going to do a pooled, just survey weighted regression, and then we're going to do the deleted group at jackknife with the with NAS weights for the standard errors. Since STIR is bounded between 0 and 200, we also do a pooled fractional logit model, and then in the paper we do individual regressions by crop and year as well. And so we're going to try to isolate the incentives of that contract, right? We're going to control for a variety of factors, including tenure length, farm class, operation acres, some operator demographic characteristics, some weather variables as well as year, crop, and county fixed effects. And what we find is that even when controlling for all these factors, we see that cash and share rented fields are coming in at 5.1, 4.7 points lower on average than owner-operated fields, respectively. The cash rented result is statistically significant. The share rented result is not. We also see that intuitively for the tenure length variable, we see that if you've been on the land for 5 to 10 years relative to 0 and 5, you're more likely to engage in conservation tillage systems, which also makes sense. For cover crops, just looking at conditional adoption rates across the owner-operated, cash rented and share rented categories. That's the O, the C, and the S for the years of our sample. No real kind of visual pattern sticks out. This might be because the adoption rates are just low altogether in this time period. But once we do a similar exercise, we do a pooled survey weighted logistic regression, we find that cash rented fields, they're 51% more likely to exhibit cover crops. Share rented fields are 29% less likely, but neither of these results are statistically significant. And once again, the tenure length variable is a good predictor of adoption. And finally, adoption of structural practices. So these are practices like buffer strips, grass waterways, practices that take land out of production. They're quite expensive to implement, very high immediate costs with benefits only realized in the long term, perhaps. There are a few patterns that stick out with conditional rates, mostly or mainly that owner operated and share rented fields kind of move together. They kind of have similar adoption rates. And this is kind of verified with our regression here, the pooled survey weighted logistic regression. We see that cash rented fields are 20% less likely to possess structural practices. Share rented are 18% less likely to possess structural practices. However, the share rented result is not statistically significant. All right, so just to kind of wrap things up, we see that the payback period matters here. Conservation tillage systems have immediate on-farm benefits realized for the operator in decreased fuel and labor costs. So we see that even after controlling those factors, we see that cash renters cash rented land or plots are more likely to or have lower STIR index values. We see that share contracts, they're more likely to be written, but they're also more likely to have the landlord in the decision making. And we kind of see that in the ARMS results, where we see that the share and own plots, they across all three categories, we can't make any statistical. There's no statistical significance between them. And then finally, cash contracts, like I said, are less likely to have landlord decision making, but we're more likely to see conservation tillage systems implemented on cash land. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, on your cover crop slide, were you including the different kinds of wheat as a cover crop?
No, this was cover crops reported for type of grain crop.
Got it.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Do you have land quality differences between, you're not looking at the way an owner, you don't have, it's not an observation of an owner on the land, say it's a farm that the owner rented in. These are just like
the way the ARMS survey phase 2 survey is structured, these are it's at the field level. So these are fields that happen to be owned or versus fields that happen to be rented. Yeah.
No, so I guess I'd be worried about the some characteristics of the land that are being rented, and also the characteristics of the person who is owning the land. Some of the more recent stuff is how to examine how farmers act on their own land to try to control for that. But.
Right. I think in later years of ARMS, I do ask about productivity and slope, I believe. Not in the earlier years, and since we were pulling this, in this exercise, we didn't include those variables, but I think for the individual crop year regressions, we do include those. Yeah, as far as the characteristics we have characteristics of the operators, we don't fortunately have characteristics of their landlord. which is unobserved to us, which like you said, I think is an important factor, especially for things like cover crops. Yeah.
Right, but how would, I mean, you would think that there would be heterogeneity types of like some land would be more suitable for cover crops than others.
Yeah.
And that there might, that, I mean, that would, well, there has been found.
Yeah.
I think precipitation would be huge, because if I look at western Kansas, I look a lot in Kansas.
Mhm.
In western Kansas, we just get so many reports of these cover crops leach precipitation out of our soil, which is so rare to begin with, that we
Mm.
can't plant cover crops. And so if you're looking at it as a structural change, or I don't think you labeled it structural, but as a change in land type, to them, it's just not possible due to precipitation constraints.
Mm.
We did control.
That's very interesting. Yeah, no, we did, but no, that's good to know. That's very interesting.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, I read your paper, so thank you very much for all the insights into the, in general, US land rental market, which is very new also to me. And I was also wondering, you talked also about social norms and the influence on the conservation practices. And whether I was wondering whether it's worth looking at also called neighboring effects, maybe to check that, whether in some areas, I mean, you included county effects, but maybe in some areas they are more likely to do so because others have started already.
So no, that's a the kind of technology adoption spillovers. This is certainly a great point. Unfortunately, with Arms Phase 2, we're unable to kind of do that sort of exercise simply because of the frequency of surveyed plots across the landscape isn't perhaps dense enough to do that. But a lot of our ongoing work at ERS with other data products is looking at, say, spillover effects with, say, cover crop and no-till adoption. Absolutely.
And then maybe I have another question, because you're also talking about very broad question, that the policy implications for this, and the introduction, you mentioned that it might have implications for climate smart agricultural forestry initiatives. So based on your results, what would you say are the implications then, that you found that there's no difference?
Right. So I don't want to make any policy statements, so to say, but I think these results were a bit surprising. At least the no-till. Well, actually, so not quite. Let me say this: for something like no-till, the on-farm benefits are a little more well measured and realized, as opposed to something like cover crops. For cover crops, there's a lot of potential on-farm benefits, both in the short, medium, and long term, but they're just a little less known at this point. What we see, though, is at the moment that we don't see owners or renters adopting them in any or owned field. I should be careful with my language. Owned field versus rented fields, adopting them at dramatically different rates. So that's all I want to say.
I just want to, so you're using Arms data in Phase 2, so it's like field level, right? So is it possible that there's farmers, so each field has one farmer and one landowners, or like they may rent it to multiple fields to the same farmers or different, right? Do you know, and how do you control it?
So yeah, so Arms Phase 2 is surveyed at the field level. We don't have we have information on the operator. So we have information on the rest of their operation. Are they primarily renting, or are they how big is it? How much do they own? How much do they rent? We don't have information on their landlord, unfortunately, which, again, as the previous presentation pointed out, seems to be a pretty vital relationship when it comes to encouraging, the practice adoption. So the only information we have from landlords is from the total survey in 2014. Unfortunately, we couldn't link that. We can't link that back to ARMS. But there should be another total survey coming out in 2024, I believe. So it should have some more information related to conservation practice adoption.
Do you have a causal explanation for the results? Do you have something?
What's that? I'm sorry.
Do you have a causal explanation or why you think you're observing?
Don't want to conjecture on mechanisms, but again, I would point to the fact that for no-till, the timeline for on-farm benefits realized is immediate, right? With immediate fuel and labor savings. So that might be why we're seeing rates of adoption on rented fields to be equal or even outpace on owned fields. I would say the benefits to cover crops, again, on-farm benefits at this point are still unknown to a lot of people, and so that's why we're across owners and renters, we're not seeing much different, because I think they're facing the same uncertainty, the same incentives. And then for structural practices, I think this makes the most sense that, big upfront costs in the short term and benefits only realized in the very long term. It makes sense that even with the amount of long-term rental relationships we see, it makes sense that cash contracts cash rented plots are lagging behind there. So
You can't draw a causal inference, but we can conjecture probably this. You see other structural improvements like maybe tile drainage, things like that.
do we see tile drainage? That is a good question. I think in later years of ARMS we may. Yeah,
I think
that would be.
something that I would think that is more structural than strips.
Mm.
Like that. So
Okay. Would there be a better name for those types of?
We just categorize
Yeah.
them all as the practices that require upfront investment. And if you're facing and you're uncertainty, then it's really risky to adopt those.
Yeah.
So we just kind of gave an umbrella term. No,
Like a buffer strip though, it's not gonna add to the bottom line for farmer. Right? You're basically
Right.
losing. Yeah. Acre. So it does seem like if there would be more production, structural production oriented practices, that'd be like drainage structures.
Mm.
That would probably be reflected in the survey, but
Okay, yeah, we'll have to check. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. How do we do this? I don't know.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Marlene Pionka. I'm from Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. And today I'm going to present you a project on bargaining power in the agricultural land rental market, which is a joint work by these co-authors and is part of the Farmland project, which is a project of different universities, mostly German which tackle different aspects of the land markets and mostly based on the German or Austrian land market, but also looking beyond. So we have a little excursion right now, maybe. And yeah, so the agricultural land prices are an outcome of a bargaining process, which reflects the peculiarities of the land market. And there, monopolies can emerge since land is heterogeneous, immobile, and limited in supply. And market power is commonly defined as the absence of competitors, which then enables to enforce higher or lower prices than in a competitive market. And since land is a fixed production factor, we can generate an economic rent, and this then relates this market power to bargaining power. And insights into bargaining power become especially relevant in light of the development of the land market. So here are some numbers for the German land market, but as I've seen in other presentations already, this also accounts for other countries, that we have a price surge and also the presence of different actors now on the market. There are non-agricultural investors who are not primarily interested in production purposes, but they are hypothesized to price local farmers out of the market and absorb all of the economic rent. And this has also fueled public debates, also in Germany, quite a lot, on whether the land market works as an efficient education device and also as a fair, market, and whether this price formation process is still fair. And this is why we want to dive deeper into this whole bargaining process and also in the concept of bargaining power. And there has been already some work on the impact of bargaining power on the price formation process with respect to hedonic pricing models. They were developed or extended for the housing market and then also taken up and applied to the agricultural land market. We take one step further maybe and focus on one specific factor, which is the reservation utility, which we identify as a very important factor to grasp the concept of bargaining power, because the land market is a search market, and when the potential tenant and landowner meet, they start to negotiate about this rent, about the division of the rent that is generated on this land. And one partner makes an offer there, and then the other one has the possibility to accept or reject this offer, and this offer then hinges on this reservation utility, which might be the value of no agreement. And these can be, for example, alternative price offers or also alternative land acquisition possibilities. So this reservation utility is very important to understand the concept of bargaining power, and also maybe allows us more to understand differences in bargaining power between different groups of actors. And the reservation utility can be identified by a structural model, by exploiting the equilibrium conditions of an underlying bargaining model. And this, for the agricultural land market, this has been already done for auctions in the German land market. They also form a relevant segment how land is being rented, especially in Eastern Germany, where everything needs to be privatized after the former GDR. And but still most of the land is being rented out via negotiations, and this is why we look at the structural estimation of bargaining models. And so this is what this aim is. This project is twofold. So first of all, we looked at how we can implement such a structural model on the agricultural land rental market, and then also retrieve the data in order to get the results here. Just brief theoretical background on how this whole project is set up. So the solution of the bargaining process can be derived from game theory. So there's the sequential bargaining model, which might be closer to reality. However, we focus on the stochastic automaton game, which is a stylized model because of data, and right now it's the simpler application, and the data is actually a relevant issue, which I will come to in a second. Again, short recap just for the stochastic automation game. So there's the division of a price Q, which might be the rent that is generated on the land. And then player one makes this offer, and player two then has the possibility to accept or reject this offer. And in case of acceptance, the price is divided according, so player one receives Q minus Y, which is what is left after the offer is given to player two. And in case of rejection, they both receive their reservation utility. So here where this reservation utility again comes into place, and it consists of a public component and a private component, and they also differ between the different players. And then we have some identification results also provided by two authors. In a perfect base Nash equilibrium here, we are able to see that player two plays a simple cut point strategy. So again, just about between settlement and disagreements. So either accepting or rejecting the offer that is made. And player one then faces the question of what is the probability that player two accepts my offer, and has a simple concave optimization problem of this optimal offer Y, which depends not only on the price, so this Q, the rent that has to be divided, but also on the own reservation utility, but also of the reservation utility of the opponent here. And they specify this then these observable components by regressors, because they want to answer the question how these changes in these components change the optimal offer, and then they are able to derive different relations between the reservation utility and the optimal offer that is being made by player one to player two. And they then we have the logit ultimatum estimator, which consists of different distributions also that are function of these regressors that I already mentioned. And the data that we need here is the offer that is made, but as well the decision that is made by the second player. So whether the offer that's made by player one is accepted or rejected. And empirical approaches for the agricultural land rental market, there have already been some determinants identified that influence this bargaining power of actors, so the personal characteristics with respect to the agricultural background, as well as the agricultural knowledge, or also the geographical proximity of the actors to the land, because land cannot be moved, and so this also plays a role whether they are more local to the land or rather absent. And then we ask the question, how do these types and also the geographical proximity influence the bargaining process and also then the rental price? And we derive different hypotheses with respect to the first one, so the actors' knowledge between farmers and non-farmers. Here, the underlying assumption again is that farmers are better informed, so they have more bargaining power and can influence the rental rates according to their wishes. Whereas with respect to the geographical proximity, there are two strands of thoughts. We already heard about the social capital theory, but also there's the argument of information asymmetry. So here, the more absent the landowner is, the less he or she knows about the land, and this also then decreases the rental rates. In the social capital theory, they say that personal interaction also alters here the rental rates, and then that the closer they are, that this will decrease actually the rental rates. We, however, turn to the first argument with the information asymmetries, that local landowners have more bargaining power compared to geographically distant landowners. With this, we have established our hypothesis and want to apply this to the agricultural land rental market. And in Germany, we typically use land transaction data for a lot of analysis on the land market. However, as mentioned, we need acceptance decisions as well as rejection decisions for our model. And typical land transaction data only show successful decisions which resulted in a transaction. And we try to get hold of other data, but data security issues in Germany didn't allow us to get information on acceptance and rejection decision. And this is why we turned to experimental data and conducted an economic experiment by creating a hypothetical bargaining situation in the agricultural land rental market. You can see here the title in German, which was sent out to different participants. So tenants and landowners were asked to participate in this bargaining situation by negotiating over the division of the rent generated on the land. And due to different factors, but also involving the pandemic, we designed this as a questionnaire and distributed it as an online link to the different participants. And to give you briefly an overview on this, we started with questions on the own agriculture experience and the experience with land rental in order to allocate the participant to a role. So either they become a tenant or a landowner, as well as, depending on what they answered with respect to the agriculture experience, a farmer versus a non-farmer. So we aimed at having these persons, the participants, answering or having a role as realistic as possible to their own experience here. And then these hypothetical bargaining situations were described to them. So depending on the role, they were either interested in renting out or renting agricultural land, and they had to negotiate with opponents on this division. And the characteristics of these opponents change throughout different independent bargaining rounds. So according to the different hypotheses that we also formulated. And then the question was always asked, how much do you offer when the rest is for you to keep, and knowing also that you only have this one chance, because as said, it's the ultimatum game. So this is, they're just negotiating once and then the negotiation is closed.
Is there variation in the opponents?
Yeah, so we have the different, so I can turn to the next. There is a variation. We decided for a within design, experimental design. So then, for example, if you're a farmer and a tenant, so the tenant is always a local farmer because only he or she would be interested in renting out land for agricultural purposes there. And they are facing different independent grounds in the sense that they are here covering a local farmer as an opponent, or a absent farmer, and then also non-farmers. So depending on our hypothesis, we have these different treatments there. And the rest is fixed in the sense that the rent that they are negotiating about is always the same, and then they're just being described. And this is also why we included this very simple symbols in order for them to easily see the variation in the opponents there, and make the decision based on or the offer that they make based on these different characteristics. So this is then what they were shown. This is also then in German, but the piece of land was described to them. So this is arable land with a rent that is generated of, we have 300 euros per hectare. And then also, as this is a local farmer, so the land is close to you, and then the person your opponent, the person you're negotiating with here in this case is a farmer, and then also is close to the land. And we varied this in the sense that here we have a non-farmer, and also this person is not close to the land but lives somewhere else, more distant to this. And this is for the experimental design. What maybe is also important here to say is that we contacted the different farmers or the participants via farmers associations on different administrative levels in Germany, as well as also based on data that we retrieved from land registries. So also in order to contact those who are not involved in farming practices, but just own land because they got it inherited for other purposes, for investment purposes. And this is ongoing work. So right now, this is we conducted the experiment already. We have not done the estimation yet, but still this is what we have so far, that we have more insights into this bargaining process by using this structural model, by looking at this reservation utility, which then enables us to detect differences with respect to bargaining power in the land rental market. And as mentioned, the political debates right now in Germany are quite huge on this. So yeah, this might also add on this. And we have already collected the data, and I just finished the descriptive statistics. So I just want to give you a brief overview of this. So what we have here are the different groups, participants who answered, and I formed different groups here. So these are the different people who made an offer. So we have the tenant, who's always the local farmer, but then we also have the landowner here, who can be distinguished between their agricultural background, so either being a farmer and then renting out the land, or a non-farmer. And then we have the different negotiating partners. So this is what I mentioned as the different treatment that I showed here. We have the landowner being local or absent, and then also being a farmer or a non-farmer. And then also with respect to the landowner, they are negotiating with the tenant, and as said, the tenant is always the farmer who is local to the land. And here mentioning this local and absent farmer means that the landowner is actually close to the land, or rather distant from the land. And what we can already see is that when a local farmer makes an offer to a local farmer here, that the mean, we're just looking at the mean right now, is higher than when he or she makes an offer to an absent non-farmer. So already implying that the local farmer as the landowner might have more information on this. So the probability that my offer is being accepted increases when I make a higher offer here. Whereas we can also see quite some differences between the landowner being a farmer or a non-farmer, that the offer that is made, so the requirement of the rent is higher when the landowner is a farmer compared to a non-farmer, because they are better informed about the local conditions there. And so we can already get a glimpse of how they are making this offer, this why that it was in the theoretical model, but this is only the beginning. And I hope to then someday present to you maybe also the finished results, and to get a better insight into this. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm open for comments and questions.
What would a non-farmer want to rent land that is suitable for agricultural purposes?
He's not renting, he's owning it.
So you're looking at those.
We are looking at both players.
Okay.
Yeah, this is exactly why I said here that we assume that the tenant is always a local farmer, because only the local farmer would be interested. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Super interesting. I'm a little bit, I'm not sold on the ultimatum game as the right way to model this, because, you know, as we're talking about it, it really seems like the reservation utility is very much endogenous and depends on a search match process, right? So you're modeling one negotiation, but if the offer is rejected by either party, the game is not over in some sense, because they can go, like, if you are a landowner and you're negotiating for a tenant and you reject that tenant's offer, there are other tenants. Right, and so the transaction costs involved in contracting are going to depend on the market size on both sides. Right, and so that's like you in some sense have endogenous bargaining power depending on alternative negotiating partners.
Yeah,
which seems like it seems to be a super important aspect of this that you're kind of missing with the ultimatum.
yes, that's true. This is also something we have discussed quite a lot already, that and also mentioned this, that normally a more sequential bargaining game in itself with the same person, but also then with the possibility to go to another person and trying to rent out the land or rent the land from another person there is more realistic. I mean, I cannot defend it so much because you're right here, but I think the insight is still valuable in the sense that the reservation utility already includes my knowledge on how many other actors there might be on the market and how many other possible offers I can get from someone else. So yeah, this is
Yeah, so then take the comment as, something that somebody's gonna say, and you try and publish it, and then you write around it, like,
Yes, yes,
that basically say, like, even, whatever. We exogenize all this aspect of the model and.
yeah, no, but thank you, good point.
Along that same lines, do you have information on the rental rates and the competitive nature of the locations? That you've done, that the survey response, which is.
For comparison, the rent.
Yeah, just,
Yeah.
do you know how competitive, say, a particular region, or even what the rental rate is for a particular?
Yeah.
kind of region?
Yes.
Totally just curious question. Do you notice any type of, since you go to summer, have you noticed any breaks in former east-west?
Yeah, so this is also a point. We said you have to define this price, or you can call it this cake that we negotiate about, right? So we gave the level of the rent generated on this land, and we actually conducted the survey in the rather eastern German states, and we're distributing it among Brandenburg, which is one federal state around Berlin, the capital there, and then also distributed among other more eastern federal states. I think, yeah, giving this survey to farmers, especially from more western states, they would find these, they could relate, or they could still answer this. However, they have a different level they have a different rental rate level there.
And like farm size is very.
Yeah, yes, in Eastern Germany, because this used to be the farmer cooperative, they are huge compared to the more southern or western regions. So yeah, the land market in itself in Germany is quite heterogeneous when it comes to the different federal states. And then also within the federal states, there might be quite some differences, but relatively smaller compared to what we can hold to. Okay, thank you very much.